Yeah.
Yeah, recording. Thank you.
Okay. So, yes, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this conference. I very much looked forward to this, and I'm very happy also to be back at Ilan, although only virtually. So today I'm going to talk about Aeneas, and you all are already thinking that Aeneas is a hero who crosses many boundaries. He crosses the sea, for example, from his old homeland to a new homeland, but also crosses the boundary of death, his descent to the underworld. So I won't talk today too much about Aeneas, the refugee or the migrant, but I will concentrate more on the vicissitudes of Aeneas and Anchise. You see from the statue you have in the first slide that I'm going to talk only about those two. Ascanio is out of the game for now. So the Aeneas myth with regard to the problem of death and its boundaries. In the case studies that I present here, we'll see how Aeneas serves to put into sharper focus the discrimination between life and death, but also how it might help us blur those boundaries. So these are small and yet key presences of Aeneas in texts where he's seen as a role model or as a hero that one can identify with. Together with the boundaries of death, we'll also cross the boundaries of generations, the elderly versus the young, or the young facing the elderly if you want. And the texts that I chose are by two public, I want to say, national Jewish intellectuals from different times, different genres, thinking about two different catastrophes. So as you might guess, my point of view, as I said, is here that of reception studies. The history of classical reception studies in Jewish culture has mainly concentrated on the Greek side. Glenda Abramson, for example, you can see it on the slide, theorized the ways in which Greek myth entered Hebrew poetry, so a very specific category. But Yaakov Shavitz's monumental study has also clarified how classical reception has reshaped modern Jewish culture, for which Athens, a symbol here, was always the ultimate other. In the book, you can see it from the subtitle, there's a conflation of classical antiquity and Greek antiquity, while Rome does not figure almost at all. But if the sense of otherness and even antagonism is true of Greece, that is even truer of Rome. And I mean, I have just these two images and they should remind you of that. So one of the preliminary questions is, can Aeneas ever become a Jewish hero in a way? On one hand, what does he offer? What can you do with him? And on the other, how can Jewish intellectuals adopt such an un-Jewish hero? And moreover, how is his presence, his resurfacing here, affected by the different national cultures within which the Jewish cultures of these two intellectuals is located? In other words, the Italian context and the Israeli context. So let me now tell you a few words about my first case study. My first case study is about Liliana Segre. If you don't know her, she was born into a middle-class Jewish family from Ilan. In 1938, she was expelled from state school as the result of the Italian racial laws. And after years of hiding, she and her father were arrested at the Swiss border while trying to cross into Switzerland. They were imprisoned and tortured for months in Italy and finally deported by the Nazis to Auschwitz. Her father died upon arrival, basically, while she came back. And after decades of silence, in the early 1990s, she started touring Italy to tell school pupils about her experiences in Auschwitz, and she's continued doing so until last October. In 2018, she received the highest civil honor with her nomination to Senator for Life of the Italian Republic. And you can see here an official portrait of her. Last June, she addressed a letter to the Maturandi. Now, you all know Latin, but Maturandi is a very special word in Italian because it designates the students about to sit the Italian school system final examination. Far from being only an administrative deadline, this exam is one of the most recurrent dreams of Italian adults. It is widely reported at length on TV and on the press. And the image that you see here is actually taken from a movie, one of the many movies about this moment. It is really truly a ritual of passage from teenager life to adulthood. In fact, once it was called maturity exam, and you see how Segre plays with this. So the concern that usually surrounds the exam became this year, as you can imagine, a sanitary concern. Italian schools had been closed for 3 months. The whole country had been under a very strict lockdown. So the exam was to be the first time that many young people would meet again their friends, would gather together. How is it possible to hold it safely? People were asking. But especially, would the youngsters become vectors of the pandemics for the elder generation of their others, of the elder in their lives? So Segre writes this letter in order to call the students to a sense of responsibility for the elders in their life. And she defines responsibility not as the opposite of irresponsibility, but as the opposite of indifference. You can see it in the first line. And then she adds, as you know, second line, I consider indifference the most insidious evil of our times. I felt on my skin and on the skin of my loved ones the results of indifference. When she says, as you know, she is drawing on her familiarity with the young audience and on her public status. She knows people know what she's talking about. She is referring to a specific place, the Track 21 Memorial, the memorial to the Italian Holocaust victims, where by her will, a great cement wall reads a gigantic indifference. And she even uses a classical story to better describe what indifference is. You can see the last quote, the story of Mithridates. This is but one of the many references to classical culture and Italian culture and European culture that we find in this very brief letter. From Horace in Latin to Defoe's Robinson Crusoe to 19th century Italian poet Giacomo Leopardi to John Donne, Segre draws the attention of the students to those stories and texts that are a common cultural patrimony and that the students themselves know from school. But one mythical figure stands out. Of course, Aeneas. Aeneas comes in at the very end, at the envoi of the letter, at the very center of the letter in a way, intellectually. Just like him, the Maturandi are seen here as unwilling heroes. And I quote, I know that for your age, it has been a heavy burden, such a long time away from your friends, from your loves, from your schoolmates. She's referring to the lockdown. It is a sacrifice that you had to do, much more than for yourself, for the segment of society that is more exposed to the epidemic, the sick, the elderly, your grandparents. I very much like to think you all as Aeneas, who rescues his father Anchise from Troy by putting him onto his shoulders, an image of great civility. This has been an important maturity, and you already passed cum laude, end quote. You can see how she plays with the idea of the maturity exam. We don't call it the maturity exam nowadays, but that's a traditional name. So here you can see the boundary between adolescence and adulthood. In other words, between the age of irresponsibility or lack of responsibility better, and the time for responsible, independent ethical choices is very clearly projected onto the boundary of life and death, the life and death of the elder generation through Aeneas. In a way, she is the elder generation talking directly to the young generation. And in her choice of Aeneas as a role model, Segre was certainly influenced by anthropologist Laura Marchetti, who called for the written care of the lives of the elderly in shocking terms, as Italy faced a dramatic shortage of intensive care units in March. Marchetti has influenced Segre, no doubt, and perhaps she's also influenced the authors of these books. These are all books that came out this year, all on Aeneas, from very different perspectives. Only one of these came out before Marchetti's article. But there's more, I think. As Segre makes Aeneas the role model hero for the Italian new adults, she is drawing near to the culture that first the school system aims to build, and second, she also draws nearer to the students themselves. As we have seen, they know these texts from school. But she is also reclaiming for herself, for an Italian Jew, a hero and a whole culture appropriated by Italian fascism. And when I say appropriated, I don't mean just used. I mean that an Italian person cannot wrestle with the legacy of Rome without wrestling with the legacy of fascism, unfortunately. So she's wrestling with the very regime that condemned her to the expulsion from the educational system, and she mentions this fact in the letter, and basically wanted her dead. Significantly, though, she shuns any pretended special connection between the first of the Romans, as a recent book calls him, and Italy, or between Latin and Roman culture at large and Italy. Aeneas figures here as one ethical hero, a special category of cultural hero, from the pantheon of heroes and autoritates from European culture. It is an all-encompassing pantheon. But also, in a way, I believe, Aeneas is probably the hero that Segre herself would have liked to be. Unfortunately, she was unable to save her father, Alberto Segre, from dying in Auschwitz, and that continued to haunt her all throughout her life. Now let me move to my second case study. We moved to another country in another time, and it's Israel of the late 50s, and you might know or might not know Yehuda Amichai. As you can see, for him too, I chose an official portrait, or actually a portrait turned into a stamp, just to give you a sense of who are we talking about. We are talking about two people of national relevance. He was one of the national poets of Israel and became a symbol of Israeliness himself, even though he was born as Ludwig Pfeiffer in Germany in 1924 to an Orthodox Jewish German family. Some years after Hitler's rise to power in 1936, the family fled Germany for then mandatory Palestine. He took part in the fighting in the war in 1948, after which the State of Israel was founded. All these facts will come back. Since his first poetry book came out in 1955, he came to be recognized as one of the greatest innovators of Hebrew poetry, and later as a national poet until his death 20 years ago. But he was also a key innovator of Hebrew prose. And in fact, I'm talking about the story today. The story was first published in a newspaper in 1959 and then republished in a collection of short stories in 1961. You can find it also translated as The Times My Father Died. But a more faithful translation is The Deaths of My Father. Notice the plural. The use of a plural, in fact, encapsulates beautifully the core of the story. The story recounts from the point of view of a son, that is Amichai, all of his stories were recognized to be heavily autobiographical, how the father goes through moments of great crisis and suffering throughout his life, that is, his metaphorical deaths. The opening of the story represents one such death during the Jewish liturgy of Yom Kippur, and I quote, "One Yom Kippur, my father stood in front of me in synagogue. I climbed up onto the seat to get a better view of him from behind. When they got to the Aleinu prayer, my father went down on his knees, like all the other people, and touched the floor with his forehead. Then he came back to life again," end quote. The father dies many other times throughout the story. During his long years in the trenches during World War I as a German soldier, he dies when he says no to the invitation of his former army friends just before the Nazis come to power. He dies when he is arrested by the Nazis for throwing a Nazi pin into a bin. But most significantly, he dies one more time when the family has to leave Germany for mandatory Palestine. So the first part of the story recounts all these metaphorical deaths, while the second part, after the typographical break you see in the slide, deals with the biological death of the father. And afterwards, there is an afterwards, in fact. So the main theme of the story is an attempt from the part of the son to overcome the uncrossable boundary of death. Since death is present all throughout the life of the father, can it be that the reverse is true? Can it be that life is also present somehow all throughout his death? A very paradoxical question that the son answers in the end of the story in an enigmatic way. And that's where Aeneas comes in, maybe. We are after the death of the father, he dies in a hospital room, he's buried, but the son has this last romance scene. And I quote, "Once I was walking along the Via Appia in Rome. I was carrying my father on my shoulders. Suddenly his head sank down, and I was afraid he was going to die. I laid him down at the side of the road with a stone under his head and went to call a taxi. Once they used to call on God for help. Now you call a taxi," end quote. The whole paragraph is very dreamy-like. At some point, the son does find a taxi, but it's too small because it looks like a snake. At the core of the scene is the son taking care of his father, transposing the hero Aeneas on himself. In the end, the last lines that you see in the slide, we're not sure if the father dies. He just disappears in the distance. So here, most interpreters have concentrated on Rome. What does it mean? And they've seen it as the antithesis of Jerusalem or as a symbol for secular life. Very basically, though, Rome here serves as an indicator of the different system of reference that Amichai is turning to, that of classical mythology. As you see, there is no mention of Aeneas. There is no, "I was carrying my father like Aeneas." If the scene were set somewhere else, we might not even think about Aeneas. But here, I think we must, because Rome clearly identifies this scene as reminiscent of the Aeneas Anchises myth. The narrator emerges here two moments from Virgil's Aeneid, Book 2 and Book 6. The first moment is clearly the flight from Troy, where Aeneas takes his father away from the burning city. And I quote from Virgil, "Come then, dear father, mount upon my neck. On my shoulders I will support you, and this task will not weigh me down." End quote. This moment is a key moment not just in the story, but also in the iconographical history of the Aeneas myth, from antiquity, several centuries before Virgil, to modern Europe and beyond. And Bernini's famous statue group is a good example, one that Amichai probably saw in his visit to Rome in the 50s. So this striking iconographical memory is set here in a specific location, much more specific than just Rome, that so much troubled the interpreters. It's the Via Appia, that is a cemetery of a dead civilization. So I think that here we enter a space twice consecrated to death. If the cemetery constituted the space of the dead within Roman society, now, as an archaeological site, it is enveloped by death at both an existential level and an historical level. And if you think that I'm stretching it too far, let me tell you that this is not the first time that Amichai gestures towards this special status. In a poem about Rome, he says, "All gates are open to death, even the San Sebastian gate, which I love." And the San Sebastian gate that is mentioned here in the poem is the gate that opens to the Via Appia, and in fact appears in the story too. Yet another poem sees an unidentified figure walking along the Via Appia. Quote, "What are they saying in the graves below the road from Rome? They are saying this: one of us is passing by who was given a few more days to live." End quote. The poem continues, underscoring the feeling of liminality of the Via Appia, where those about to die can somehow already converse with those who are already dead, while all others are cut off. Apart from the setting, there is also one other textual hint that links this last poem that I mentioned, and you see in the slide, to the story, the way in which death itself is described as an interrupted radio transmission. So the liminal Via Appia is then a place where the son can meet his father, even after his biological death. In a way, this scene is a dreamy projection of the son's desire to meet his father again, just like Aeneas' desire to meet his father Anchise. And Aeneas does see his father in his dreams, as we are told in book 4, and as it happens in book 5 of the Aeneid. Similarly, the son too experiences the presence of the father in his dreams, the son of Amichai. Just before the Roman scenes, the son tells us, and I quote, "My father still keeps dying. He comes to me in my dreams, and I'm afraid for him and say, 'Take your coat, walk more slowly, don't talk, you mustn't get excited, take a rest from this awful war.'" End quote. Just like Aeneas traveled to the underworld in order to meet his father, in the Via Appia the son finds a personal, if secular and imagined, underworld. The narrator so merges the end of book 2 that we have seen with Aeneas' descent to the underworld in book 6. Really, these two scenes are linked to one another in the Aeneid itself. And in fact, and you can see it on the screen now, Aeneas' prayer to the Sibyl mentions that very moment. I quote, "Amid flames and 1,000 pursuing spears, I rescued him on these shoulders and brought him safe from the enemy's midst." End quote. Although the story focuses on the father, one can see here that it is also a portrait in the mirror of the son. The story deals with the son distancing from Orthodox Judaism. You could see that we had some jokes about God, Axi and God, and at some point at the beginning of the second part, it is said that God didn't know if the father was dead or not. But also, the story deals with the son's Israeliness. For both of these two things, the father constitutes a perfect counterpart. In the past, at least, in Zionism, a core dichotomy existed between the diasporic religious Jew, the father, and the Jew of the land of Israel, the son. In fact, from the very beginning of the story, we know that the son is going to end up in Israel. In light of this dichotomy, and in light of the Roman epilogue, we can project back the figure of Aeneas onto the story. He's not only the rescuer of his father or the visitor of the underworld, as we see in the Roman epilogue, but also the refugee in flight from the catastrophe, in this case, the Holocaust. Thus, the Anchises Aeneas polarity reverberates on the father, who dies when he has to leave Germany, and never will become an Israeli Jew, just like Anchise leaves his old homeland, but never will get to the new homeland. And on the other hand, the son, who becomes, arms in his hand, remember that I mentioned the war of 1948, he becomes one of the founders of the new country. The un-Jewish hero, surprise, surprise, becomes even a Zionist hero. Noticeably though, the name of the hero does not appear in Amichai. While the story references Jewish liturgy and biblical figures such as Moses, the prophet Elisha, and Shem, the name of Aeneas cannot find a place in the story. All those who already know the story will get the illusion, and Rome, the reference to Rome, will confirm their reading. Remember, Segre and Amichai are two national intellectuals, while Liliana Segre, the voice of the nation, proudly offers Aeneas as a human ethical model for all of humanity, specifically for the students who are about to take the exam at the time of the COVID-19 epidemics. She is reclaiming the hero from fascism. Segre's Aeneas is a much different hero from the exclusivist, imperialistic, even racist hero that fascism wanted. Amichai, differently, exercises here his art of indirection as he builds his own Israeli character in the story. Against the diasporic character of the father, he cannot indulge too much in what would have been perceived, I think, as a remnant of European diasporic, in a way even decadent culture. So in short, as both Segre and Amichai wrestle with the problem, collective and personal, of death and its boundaries, consolidating them or blurring them, and on the relations between different generations, the young and the elderly, by reflecting on the Virginian Aeneas myth. As they do so, they also have to wrestle not only with the un-Jewishness of the hero, but also with the constraints of history and ideology, past and present. After all, as every one of us has seen this year, death is very much a political matter. And I thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much, Giacomo, for a very thought-provoking talk about Aeneas, the Jewish hero, which is actually makes a lot of sense because he's running from his burning home and bringing not also his father, but also his son with him as the new future or building the new country. You know, the father and the son are always linked together. So I'm opening the floor for questions. Any questions for Giacomo?
Yes,
Okay.
I would more than I would quote one of Amichai's known poems. I read it in Hebrew, then you may translate it, or I'll try to translate it into Hebrew, which points out indifference. And it says, the first two lines, El male rachamim, el male rachamim, hayu arachamim ba'olam ve'lo rak bo, which would translate as God is full of mercy, and if the God was not full of mercy, mercy would be in the world and not only in him, which is kind of, you know, a pointing a finger towards God being indifferent, not only human, but also God is indifferent.
Right, yes, Amichai had this, all throughout his work, we can see that he's very, he talks a lot about God, but his God is either his father, actually he talks a lot about his father in terms of God, or as he calls him Sadran, so somebody who puts order, but is not even good at putting order. I remember there's an interview that you can find actually on the internet where he says, well, if you think about the Holocaust, do you think that he put good order? And so this story is actually one of the stories that people usually quote when trying to wrestle with the distancing of Amichai from his father, because his father is really representative of that national Judaic religion. And he suffered a lot when Amichai, already at age 15, basically strayed away from orthodoxy. And I guess that was part of his building this secular Israeli character.
Thank you.
Thank you for the comment.
Michal, I think you had a question. No?
There were lots of things in the paper, so I hope I didn't confuse anybody's mind.
No, actually, Lisa, you have a question?
Yeah, how did you know? I didn't actually say it, but I do.
Yeah.
Not so much it's a question comment. The idea about putting the stone under his head on the Via Appia reminds me of the situation. The person who puts a stone under their head is Jacob, when he is fleeing from Beersheba to Haran and going to leave the land of Israel. So it's also at a liminal point, and there it's a question of what's going to be, and they have the dream of say in English, the angels coming up and down the ladder. But Amichai takes a very different route with it and sees it as a point of leaving rather than a point of hope or return after that. But do you think he was using that consciously, the idea of the stone under the head, or is that just a coincidence, if there is such a thing?
Thank you, Lisa, for the precious comment. No, I definitely think that he was very much aware of that. I mean, his knowledge of the traditional Jewish text was thorough, and all throughout the story we have, as I said, we have references to the liturgy, but also to biblical figures. So that is definitely true. The problem here is also that the scene is imagined to happen in Rome, and again, the interpreters of the story before me have tried to understand where the son is going. In other words, is he distancing himself from Rome or entering Rome? Because if he's entering Rome, then Rome might be the symbol for secular life, which of course would be very easy to imagine, Jerusalem and Rome as opposites. But the story doesn't really say. And I actually think that here the fact that the father stops at the San Sebastian gate might be what Amichai is pointing at. San Sebastian gate is a Christian name for an ancient Roman building. So I tend to think that it's actually a reference to the European diasporic culture where the father is kind of trapped. He cannot move from there, and he always stays in this state between life and death. So the idea that I should go back to working also on the idea of Jacob and the stone under his head, because again, the idea of bantering, of being about to leave or to enter a place is very much at the center of the story. So for that reason, I also thought that this was the perfect conference where to present about this. And really, thank you for organizing all this.
It was mostly Lily, but thank you. Again, the Jacob thing, who is he fleeing from is Esau, who represents Edom, which represents Rome. So there's a very clear connection between what he's fleeing from and Rome, which might imply that he's fleeing from Rome rather than going towards it. But I don't know. Thank you. Fascinating paper.
Thank you.
I think, Lily, you have a question?
Yeah, just a comment, and I would love to hear your ideas about it. What I find very interesting, looking backwards to Anastasia's talk and also to your talk, Giacomo, is the fact that empathy reappears, and I'm wondering whether this is just our modern sensitivity, or is there something in the classical text that a sort of empathy that goes through them?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's actually something that I've been thinking a lot about. So one of the questions at the beginning is, what does he offer? I think there is kind of an affordance, if I may use this this is a common term now in archaeology, but I do believe that there is certain affordance for certain uses and themes in classical, different classical myths. It's easy to see in Aeneas a sort of an orphan. So I believe that it's also easy to feel empathy for Aeneas as an orphan. Now, you could say to me, but he has a father, we've seen it, and he has also a divine mother. But in book one, so the very beginning, there's a heartbreaking scene, which every time I read it, I have to stop, because Aeneas meets his mother and says to her, he recognizes her sort of late, and says, "Mother, why you never stop? Why can I never hug you?" So in a way, he's orphaned from the mother, and for a long part of the Aeneid, he's also orphan of the father, and there is this attempt to find him in the underworld. I think that, and I don't know from where Anchise reading is coming. I know that he was a great lover of T.S. Eliot, and of course, T.S. Eliot wrote what is a classic, Thinking of Virgil. But he definitely appreciated the empathetical side of the Aeneas myth, and so does Segre. And you can see that Ascanio is not present here, and I believe that that's part of it. Ascanius, if we had Ascanius too, we would be thinking more about generational continuity. Here we are thinking more in a polarized way about father and son. It's really a family relation more than other relationships. I hope that answers your question. Perhaps it was too long.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if you have no more